we have one more great talk this afternoon and then another one this evening yet. It's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce to you Dr. Jim Donche, who is the director of the Johnson Center for Environmental Innovation at Gustavus Adolphus College.
In 1998, I moved to a small city on the eastern end of Indonesia. For the next 3 years, I had the incredible good fortune to enjoy some of the most spectacular coral reefs in the world, located up and down the coast where I lived. While I was aware of the incredible biodiversity of coral reefs and the critical role they played both played by the reef ecosystem for both ocean health and for human well-being, I have to confess that I spent most of my hours on the reefs not in an active scientific mode, but rather in rapture at the raucous colors and mind-boggling diversity of the reefs. But no matter, for while I was in awe, Dr. Ove Hoegh-Guldberg was hard at work about 1,500 miles to the south of me, making scientific sense of the coral reef ecology and coral physiology of the Great Barrier Reef. Dr. Ove Hoegh-Guldberg comes to us from Australia, but his roots lie closer to our own institution's Scandinavian heritage. His Danish grandfather came to visit his grandson in Australia while on butterfly collecting expeditions for the Danish Museum. While with his grandfather on one of those expeditions, Dr. Hoegh-Guldberg was introduced to butterflies of a different sort, butterfly fish on the Great Barrier Reef of Australia. The image of those fish, which he describes as a tattoo on his brain, captured his imagination, and ultimately the reefs that were home to those fish captured his career. As a teenager, he had 16 or more, I've seen two numbers, aquariums in his house, and spent his free time snorkeling on the reefs. After he and his friends had collected fish for the Manly Oceanarium for several years, that institution asked Hoegh-Guldberg and a friend to tend their new exhibit, a 3.5-meter tiger shark. Their duties included scuba diving in the tank, with one of them fending off the shark with a plastic pipe, while the other cleaned the aquarium windows. You can imagine the conversation. "Hey, Mom, we're off to feed the shark." "Oh, that's nice, Ove. What are you going to feed it?" Hoegh-Guldberg went on to complete his Bachelor of Science degree with honors from the University of Sydney. Leaving there, he set off for Great Britain with an Oxford scholarship in hand. On his way, however, he stopped in Los Angeles to visit a world-famous coral reef scientist. When that scientist offered him a chance to join a research expedition to the Middle East, he jumped at the chance, gave up his Oxford scholarship, cashed in his airline ticket, and joined the expedition. He followed up that abrupt change in plans by completing his Ph.D. in marine sciences at UCLA. Although he did face some financial challenges as a result of his decision, his wife, Dr. Sophie Dove, says that he was sleeping in the lab for his room at the point she met him. Returning to Australia and taking a position with the University of Sydney, Hoegh-Guldberg focused his career on the ecology of coral reefs and the coral organisms that sustain them. His work was instrumental in establishing the clear connection between ocean warming and the massive coral bleaching events that began to occur in the 1980s. And in particular, he helped establish the physiological mechanisms that connect water temperature to that bleaching. As Hoegh-Guldberg made his discoveries, he began to speak publicly about the threats that climate change posed to the Great Barrier Reef through warming ocean temperatures and ocean acidification. As have other scientists who have made these connections, he faced public criticism and controversy for his position. But over time, his research and conclusions have withstood the scrutiny and won him the respect of his peers. Reflecting on the challenges he faced in alerting a scientific and policy community to a challenge they did not want to accept and facing Facing the risk that he might be proven wrong, Hoegh-Guldberg felt then and now that the risk was worthwhile in the light of the value of the Great Barrier Reef ecosystem to humanity. I quote, "I thought that, okay, then if I'm wrong and I get egg on my face, then the egg would be the sweetest egg ever." In 1999, he was awarded the Australian Museum's Eureka Prize for scientific research. Many other honors have followed. In 2012, he was named an Australian Laureate Fellow by the Australian Research Council. Today, Dr. Ove Hoegh-Guldberg comes to us from his dual positions as Director of the University of Queensland's Global Change Institute and Deputy Director of the Australian Research Council's Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies. The latter institution hosts the world's largest concentration of coral reef scientists. Dr. Hoegh-Guldberg, we have asked you to come a long way from Australia, and we are a long way from the ocean. Thank you for coming to share your love of that ocean with us, and please accept our warm welcome.
Well, I just said to Jim that was probably the best introduction I've ever had, although I feel a little naked now. I do have an amazing mother and father because they did let me and Barry Bruce, Barbara Block would know Barry, have this job at the Oceanarium, and she trusted that there was somebody supervising us, but there wasn't. But I'm here today to say that, and Barry's now a white shark researcher in Tasmania, that we got through those. It was good money too. Anyway, look, I wanted to start by saying really three things. The first is in the last 2 days here in Minnesota, that's how you say it, right? Yeah? That's one thing I've learnt. It's a great state, by the way. It's just what a wonderful college, wonderful students, a wonderful president, and what a wonderful conference we have here, and what an amazing audience. We dream of audiences like this at the University of Queensland. So it's really amazing that this has been going on for, well, 48 years in terms of the conference, but that Gustavus Adolphus College is celebrating 150 years. I mean, that is incredible. Amazing. And it really humbles us we've just celebrated our centenary. And I thought that was pretty good, but we're a bit humbled now. The next thing I want to say is to say thank you to all the people that have actually hosted us, and particularly President Ole, Chuck, Jim, Tara, Matt and Jake, and the many other people that have really made me feel very welcome here. And then the third thing I want to say is who sandwiched me between two of the most cleverest environmental philosophers and writers after all the other scientists had their, it's tricky. So I'm going to show how limited I am by comparison, because you have before, me, and then after. But I'll do my best. But I think some of the messages I'm going to talk about today about that great ecosystem will be almost like a worked example of where science is going and where we need to go. And hopefully there are hooks on this which I think we can build in the messages that we've heard so far from Kathleen, and I'm pretty sure we're going to hear from Carl. So let me just get to the first image. I want to introduce you to the Great Barrier Reef. And by the way, those images behind, I'm an amateur videographer and very amateur, but those fish were very much outside my lab on Heron Island. And that's a great privilege, because I actually do live on part of the Great Barrier Reef that's in extremely good shape right now. But let me just show you some of those organisms that live on coral reefs. And so coral reefs are this amazing thing that you see from space. And it is, I think, one of the few signs of life on our planet. So when you look at that ecosystem, and I want to stop it right there if I can. And just to look at the number of species in that photograph. Does anyone know how many species live on a coral reef? I hear 1 million. Well, you know what the answer is? We don't know. and that's not because I have been a poor scholar, that's happened as well, but the rate of discovery of new species on the Great Barrier Reef is such that it's probably, or coral reefs like the Great Barrier Reef, is somewhere between 1 and 9 million species, a large number of which are unknown to science. And one of the expeditions I'll talk about later in this talk, 6 days with robots going down to the euphotic zone on the Great Barrier Reef, we discovered a new species of pygmy seahorse and 4 new species records of corals in Australia. There's just so much to be found on this ecosystem. Well, it's very much an inspiring place. I mean, when you swim across a reef and you see the beauty and the life, this dazzling, infinite array of shapes and colours and even noises, fish underwater make enormous sounds. And you look at these creatures like the manta ray. Anyone seen a manta ray? They're fantastic creatures. And they're all part of this ecosystem. And of course, the ecosystem is more than just beautiful and important in terms of its genetic heritage and so on. It also feeds about 500 million people across the planet, which are often in very impoverished communities that have no other place to go. And then if you take a look at other values, coral reefs break the power of waves and thereby protect islands and coastlines, so they have another role there. And in addition to that, in developed countries like the US and Australia, there are huge tourist industries. And in fact, the state I come from, quite ironically, the largest industry is exporting coal. The second largest industry is the Great Barrier Reef. Brings in $6 billion each year in tourism and supports 63,000 families in terms of employment. So these are incredibly valuable systems. Now, this is a beautiful place, but what if I were told you that it'll be gone in 20 to 30 years? And what if I told you that it didn't have to happen? And what if I told you that it would only cost a little bit to fix? In fact, it's the economic argument, not the environmental argument here, that's so straightforward. And in fact, that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to try and show you essentially where we're going. Then I'm going to ask you, that question, or, we'll all ask that question, what do we do about this? And then weigh up the options. And it's a no-brainer. And so I'm going to do, whoops, I've hit the wrong key here. I want to talk about the reef's end, I want to talk about the way out, and I want to talk about the call to action. And that'll sort of, I think, resonate a little bit, although with slightly ADD way of doing it, with the beautiful words that Kathleen was telling us. All right, well, coral reefs are threatened by a range of different factors, and there's overfishing. We're taking the fish off coral reefs. And of course, this is a real problem because fish are not there just for humans to eat. They actually have all these roles to play in the ecosystem, like keeping the algae down. We're also disturbing coastlines, so we're putting in agriculture, growing crops that need fertiliser and so on, and a lot of the sediments and nutrients are flowing out into the coastal waters and killing coral reefs. Well, unfortunately, I'm going to talk about those today. Those are very significant problems, but the problem that looms extremely large, as Chris told us this morning in his lecture on ocean acidification, is the issue of climate change. And so I think many people in this room will realise that we need the greenhouse effect. And so when you look at our planet, you can see rock, you can see water, and you can see this thin, fuzzy little atmosphere. Now, taking David Gallo's calculations, where he took all the water off the planet, put it into another little planet, water world. So he had a big rock one, and he had a little water one. I was saying, well, if you liquefied the atmosphere, put the atmosphere right down, how much volume would that be? And what you find out is that if you squish all the air into a liquid, so the entire atmosphere, it's only 12 metres thick. So literally there's 1,000 times So there's a lot less water than there is rock on the planet, and there's a lot less atmosphere than ocean on this planet. But this atmosphere is extraordinary. It's actually the reason why we're not at the temperature that you see on a planet without an atmosphere, which is 30 degrees Celsius below today. I think even Minnesotans would find that difficult. And of course, it's added on to your already interesting climate. But this blanket is really important. And the reason it has the ability to do that are due to the greenhouse gases. But of course, the problem is, as you've heard, and if you've been in these other lectures, is that the concentration of those gases is changing. And we heard about CO2 rising above where it's been for perhaps millions, if not tens of millions of years. Other compounds, such as methane, a very powerful greenhouse gas, and other ones like nitrous oxide, building up in the atmosphere. And we know when we look at the signal in the oceans and so on, and we look at what's going into the atmosphere, that this is coming from fossil fuels. We know that from things like isotope ratios and the sort of balance of those. And so what you're seeing over time is that the blanket, which is very thin and is keeping us warm, is getting thicker by these gases. And of course, when that happens, we're now starting to change the temperature of the planet. And of course, I think also this audience would be incredibly familiar with this little graph down the bottom there, which is how global temperature has changed over the last 150 years. And what you see is we've gone up about 0.8 of a degree Celsius due to that extra CO2, methane that's come from fossil fuels, and to a lesser extent from deforestation and land use change. Now, I also have a role in the IPCC as the coordinating lead author for one of the chapters. This one's on the oceans. And the new modelling that's come out, which is the consensus of probably 40 different modelling groups and nations that come together to do that crystal ball gazing that's really important in trying to inform decisions today. And so what you get is, when you look at those predictions, you get a bunch of lines like this. Now, notice that we're, and I'll try and be fancy here, here's the arrow, so that's the end of the century. And you see a bunch of lines up here that relate to different amounts of heat being trapped. So the 8.5 watts per metre squared is the extra energy that's being essentially trapped under that high scenario, which is where we don't take much action to deal with the problem of greenhouse gases. And we get onto this red curve, which, as you see, goes to 8, possibly 12 degrees eventually, many centuries from now. We'll be putting the course on the world on a course which will take us to these extremely high temperatures. Now, you need to reflect on the fact that just with 0.8 degrees Celsius, we're already facing issues, and I'll get to this with respect to coral reefs, but of course we're seeing a wide range of other impacts that are occurring through this tiny change. So now just think about people a couple of centuries later, and indeed our grandchildren and great-grandchildren at the end of this century, and think about the trouble that they will have if it's all linear. But of course it's not. It's actually non-linear. So it may be actually a lot worse than just simply what the curve would say. Now, the better scenarios are those at the lower end, of course, and this is where we take effective action on greenhouse gases. And as I'll show you, this is really the only way, the safe route out of there. All right, well, the ocean plays an enormous role in the planetary heat balance, in the gas concentration of the atmosphere. And if you're in Chris's lecture this morning, you would have heard that 25% of that anthropogenic CO2 coming from the burning of fossil fuels is ending up in the global ocean. At the same time, over 95% of the heat, the extra heat being trapped by that enhanced greenhouse effect, is disappearing into the ocean. So the ocean, in a way, is acting to dampen the climate change signal. It's absorbing. Water has a huge heat capacity, so it's able to take in a lot of energy without a commensurate change in temperature. And so this whole system is incredibly important. And so I'm going to be talking about the heat side, the CO2 side. Yes, it's taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, but as we heard, that causes ocean acidification, which is a very scary thing because it will, once you've changed the ocean pH and you discover it's a bad thing, you can't change it for tens of thousands of years because you've got to wait for the weathering of rocks. And that question I asked on the panel, which could you change the ocean pH back to where it was by using chemical means, is impossible. It's 63 times around the planet with coal trucks of material that you'd have to put into the oceans. Well, to give you an idea about the energy that's gone into the ocean, you need to look at this graph. This is basically how the heat content of the oceans has changed. So it's the added heat you're seeing here on those oceans. So you're at 14 degrees, you've got a certain amount of heat in the ocean. This is what's been happening as we've been trapping that extra heat. And what you see here is that most of it's going into the ocean, as I said, a little bit into land resources. But the equivalent here of that energy is the equivalent, and you can calculate this, it's the equivalent of 2 atomic bombs going off per second going into the ocean. So it's this amazing amount of heat that's being trapped. And of course, not surprisingly, we're seeing a very consistent increase in global temperature. Now that said, you still have, and this is a picture of the comparison of 2010 relative to the period from 1951 to 1980. And what you see here is that there are some incredibly hot places, such as Russia. You've got a lot of warming at the poles and so on. But there's also a very consistent signal in the oceans, which is somewhere around 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. That's been sort of, that extra energy's gone into the ocean and the temperature has changed by that. And so, at the start of it, it seems like a pretty small amount of heat, right? I mean, what's 1 or 2 degrees between friends, right? Especially in this place. Oh, it's minus 32 today. Oh, no, it's going to be minus 30 because we took care of the greenhouse effect. It's probably not worth doing, eh? I'm starting to sound like a Canadian. I'm not very good at accents, okay? Anyway, so what I want to do now is talk about my involvement with understanding how those changes were affecting coral reefs. And it starts, and I wasn't expecting such a complete biography. The one thing I did when I didn't go to Oxford was I forgot to write to the professor that I was meant to be studying with at Oxford. And he'd established me a place in Balliol College, and it was all good. And there was a bit of, I don't really want to break his heart. And then I got a letter from him, and it said, it was 6 months into my Ph.D. at UCLA, and he said, "Dear Ove, just wondering if you're going to take up your digs at Balliol College." And I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? Anyway, I never got to work at Oxford. And I still can't. Anyway, the one thing that stopped me in my tracks when I dropped into Los Angeles, and I really didn't know whether Los Angeles was on the west or the east coast of the US. In Australia, we'd been, very much part of the empire, and everyone looked to the mothership for education. And everyone thought that, well, the Americans, what could they know? It wasn't that bad, but so I ended up in the lab of this guy, and Len did say, come with me to the Red Sea, and I did sleep on the floor of the lab for a while because it took a while for me to get a job. I could live on $2 a day in LA, which is amazing, You can get a bag of day-old bagels, and then every 2 days you go to a salad bar, and you fill up with eggs and bacon, and you can sustain yourself indefinitely. I should write a book about that, don't you think? I mean, that's pretty useful information. Anyway, Leonard Muscatine was really the preeminent scholar of understanding the relationship between these tiny single-celled plants that live inside corals that take them from being animals and make them into being plants. And I I really came into the lab, and just the wonder of biology, this passion that had been there. You know, I think it was 20 tanks, I don't know. It's a large number of tanks at home. But I'd always been fascinated by corals, this sort of symbiosis between tiny polyps, that's about 1 millimetre or 2 across, and tiny little cells which are 1/100th of a millimetre in size. And these things, the algae down in the bottom there, live inside the gastric tissues of the coral. And they act like chloroplasts, and they pump out all this carbon. So it's a great relationship because the coral gets all of this energy, and in return is giving the algae access to waste products. And it turns out in tropical seas, which are very low in terms of nutrients, having fertiliser is really important. So this symbiosis is pretty marvellous because it's at the heart of coral reefs. Without it, you don't get the energy to lay down the enormous amounts of calcium carbonate, which make those reef systems that provide the support to fisheries, that protect coastlines, and that ultimately are food and employment for 500 million people, 1 in every 10 on the planet, or 1 in every 12. I need to update that. Now, these ecosystems, they seem so large, so robust and everything, and they build the Great Barrier Reef, and you eventually get to this idea that, well, you know, they really are tough. They could appear on that ExxonMobil poster, you know, tough for what it was. Was it, yeah, tough mother, I don't know. Was that rude? Oh, sorry. Anyway, about the time, it's the early 1980s, I'm sleeping on the floor, I eventually get an apartment in Santa Monica, it's all good. But these samples started to come in from the Caribbean, from some of Len's colleagues. And they were corals which had suddenly gone white over a couple of weeks, and in many cases got diseased and died. And pioneering NOAA research, natural resource managers like Billy Causey were sending these samples to Len to say, well, what's going on here? And what he was describing was this general paling of corals across large sectors of the Caribbean. And so at first it was, well, is it a disease? Because about that time there'd been a disease that had wiped out sea urchins and had a huge impact on Caribbean ecosystems. You know, was it due to pollution? You know, what was it? And so at that time, that was really my first introduction to, as it turned out, to an impact of climate change on corals. And so as we went to study these things, there were a couple of things that stood out. One is that when you looked in the literature, there were references to the odd coral being bleached on a reef, like you're going along a reef and then there's one, and so on. But no reports anywhere of reefs going white, you know, across square kilometres of territory. No report in the literature. Now that could be because, you know, we didn't see it and we didn't report it, and bandwagon effect. Maybe someone discovers it first and everyone sees it and so on. But it was really remarkable because when you travelled around and it started to occur elsewhere in the world, there was no reports of it being. It was so obvious that you'd have to report it. It'd be the dream paper for a Ph.D. student to be able to write up that I saw a reef go really white and so on. What we also discovered was that it was triggered by 1 to 2 degree increases in sea temperature, tiny increases above the summer temperature, and you had this impact going on. And as we went through the 80s into the 90s, the intensity and frequency of events increased, and we started to see mass mortalities. So we saw all these things going on, this increase in frequency and so on. 1998 was the wake-up year. This is where, and I still remember this, the first reports came over in the Eastern Pacific of massive coral bleaching, entire reefs going white. By the time NOAA had contacted us with the reports on hot water on the Great Barrier Reef, you better look for coral bleaching, we had the worst case of coral bleaching ever. Half the reef, which is, you know, it's 345,000 square kilometres, the park's about 375,000 square kilometres. Half of the corals in that park had bleached. It then turned up in the Western Indian Ocean, where most reefs, from the Maldives, Seychelles to the east coast of Africa, had bleached. And then as the Northern Hemisphere summer came along, Southeast Asia bleached, the red parts of the Western Indian Ocean in the Northern Hemisphere, and then the Caribbean had its worst case of bleaching. And by the end of that year, there was a global loss of 16% of the world's corals. 16%. And in some places, like the West Indian Ocean, they lost half their corals. Now, I know we have things like the pine bark beetle in North America, but just imagine if you woke up one morning to find that in the last 12 months, you'd lost 46% of all the trees in North America. And that's the equivalent. Corals being nailed in this way are like removing trees. So it was really, everyone was concerned that this really nailed the idea that it was due to temperature. And one of the most important parts of this was that it's not just about corals. Corals are that framework into which all those other species sit. So when you remove that framework, you remove the habitat of the fisheries, the biodiversity. And this is just a case where a reef has been removed by bleaching and a whole range of different impacts. What you're left with is something that doesn't have many fish. And I'll go back to that original photo. This is sort of a pretty healthy reef outside my lab on Heron Island. I'm trying to say that I have a lab on Heron Island. You heard that a couple of times, I hope. I'm getting jealous. Well, it's something for the people that are coming into the career. Pick your study site carefully. I think that's been said already. Coral reefs have never let me down. But anyway, so what happens is that you lose this structure and you lose that function, and this has now been quantified by Sean Wilson and others, who've compared reefs that were affected in 1998 to different extents and looked at the fish communities. And what they find here is that fish like this butterfly fish that eats coral, has to hide in coral and so on, disappear. So anything below the x-axis here is a loss. But then some fish did better. And it turns out that they're fish like this guy here, which is a parrotfish that eats algae. So they're not so tied to coral. But what these guys have found since then is that even fish like parrotfish that don't eat coral as adults and aren't so dependent, the juveniles are often hiding in amongst live coral. They need a complex substrate. So this is probably an underestimate of the impact of losing coral on reefs. And this is just to give you an idea of the scale of these things. This is another bleaching event on the Great Barrier Reef in 2002, where 60% of the Great Barrier Reef was affected. And what you're looking at here are these corals that have lost those symbionts. You're looking at a lot of corals that are dying. We went here with journalists that were retching from the really foul smell coming off this. And what you're looking at here is a graveyard of corals. Now, if you go back to this place today, which is on the Keppel Islands, you'll see probably about 10% of the corals you see in this picture today. So it's a huge impact. Well, as I said, we know that it's largely due to temperature. And the reason that we know this is the excellent work of the NOAA Coral Reef Watch program, flying satellites that can detect the skin temperature of the ocean, and looking at over long periods of time, they can actually detect anomalies in sea temperature. And this is 1998, when we had the 50% of the Great Barrier Reef affected. Where it's yellow, it's about 1 degree warmer. Where it's orange, it's about 2 to 3 degrees warmer than normal. And you can see the coast over which the Great Barrier Reef sits had a lot of heat anomalies there. And this is 2002 that I just showed you that picture from. And this is a real-time build-up as you go into our summer and out into the autumn. You can see also you've got this large amount of heat, extra heat in the water. And in fact, it turns out that relationship between the heat anomaly, the temperature anomaly, and coral bleaching is so good that there's a predictive service, or I guess it's a forecasting service that NOAA runs, which will actually 80% of the time predict what's going to happen to a reef based on those temperature anomalies. So that's really the proof is in the eating of the pudding, right? So the other thing you can do with these sort of data is that because it's so predictable that you get to a certain temperature in a certain region and you're there for a certain period of time, you can actually then predict whether it's going to be bleaching, severe bleaching or mass mortality based on that temperature anomaly. And here's some data from Tahiti, which I published some years ago, showing summer, winter, a bunch of years from 1981 to 1999. And here are the bleaching events, the arrows, those arrows there. And you can see that it gets above about 29.4 and you get a bleaching event. Well, you can take that number and say, okay, if I go to the modelling community, those people that know about what temperature is likely to do in oceans as we go forward in an enhanced greenhouse world, when will it exceed that temperature? That temperature we know causes coral bleaching. So I remember doing this in the Blue Mountains. It was a lovely day. We had our first house. We had our first child. And I was sitting there on a Sunday afternoon fiddling around with those numbers that I'd got from the climate modelers. And so I put the numbers into the model. Here's the trigger for coral bleaching, and here's what they said. And it kept on, every time I ran, put the two data sets together, I found that the temperature of oceans on a doubling of CO2 exceeded the threshold for coral bleaching at about 2030, 2040. And I thought, that's got to be wrong. I was thinking it would be like 150 years into the future. I'd get my time on the reefs and then it'd be good. But I know, very selfish. Kathleen will probably castigate me later. And quite rightfully so. I've reformed. But what I found was that the climates that we were creating with relatively mild amounts of warming were presenting huge problems. Now, about this time, we also became aware of ocean acidification. And this, of course, is the evil twin of the warming effects of CO2, and it's that CO2 going into the ocean, decreasing the carbonate ion concentration, changing the pH, and then having a whole series of impacts on things like corals, and as we know now, the navigation ability of fish and other organisms. Really big effects. Well, one thing to sort of do here is to run those experiments yourself. And so this is a picture of Heron Island. As you see, it's an awful place. There's no football field. There's no supermarket. There's sand that can get in your eyes. There's sharks. Well, it's the most beautiful place on the planet. If you ever want to see something on the Great Barrier Reef, Heron Island is the place to go. And that's where we have a lab. And what we've been doing, and this is Sophie, the ever-suffering, but we've been collaborating on a bunch of experiments where we've been simulating future worlds to see whether these associations that come out of the models are in fact true. And so down in this corner here is what we call the jacuzzi experiment. These are containers about the size of jacuzzis in which we've got water flowing in and flowing out, so it's being pumped straight from the reef crest and so on. We put into those experiments little mini reefs, so we've got corals, we've got fish, we've got a whole bunch of things, so we make a little part of the reef, and then we manipulate the temperature and the CO2 content of those experimental chambers. And we've replicated and done all the things you have to do statistically. And the results are quite remarkable. Here over in this corner, there I should say, we've got sort of some of the details of the experiment. And basically we're taking the local temperature and we're adding on what you would get if you went down that red line that I showed you into the future. So you add 5.6 degrees heating, you add a certain amount of CO2 to that, versus pre-industrial. So we actually take out CO2 and cool the chambers. And then we've got today, which is about 1 degree warmer. It has 100 parts per million more CO2 and so on. And then we run these simulations. And so I wanted you to just, and these experiments run for 8 months, so they really take a long time. Oh, I've now got the mouse. Here we go. So firstly, here's the pre-industrial. You can see some corals. It's over 8 months. These are sort of weekly photographs. And here's what happens. So you can see the corals still stay brown. The sea cucumber is enjoying life. They're very cerebral animals, by the way. You see that black one there? That's a sea cucumber, I should say. Let me see here. Yeah, there's a sea cucumber. But it's a little ecosystem. The other thing to notice is that over here, this coral here is a very sensitive coral. It's growing like crazy. You see all those little branches? They're new branches. So this is a very healthy coral reef. Interestingly, we did see a little bit of bleaching. And that sort of shows that that's probably part of the ecology. It's there. It's just how much bleaching you get. Now look at that red scenario. So we start off. You can see the coral suddenly went white as the temperatures were coming in. They have that extra added temperature to the signal. And you can see eventually they die. And they get covered by algae. And so what you see here is that there's a coral that actually survives 8 months of this treatment. And that's interesting in itself. So there may be some tough corals that get through this. But if you look here where we had that very delicate coral, you've lost Mr. Sea Cucumber is not there with his madam. It's a very different world. And this looks a lot like what we're seeing in nature. And I think it gives us some confidence. If we look at the reef accretion rate, so calcification is this important process that corals do, and that's how they build the reefs and so on. And the flip side of it is that they will erode over time. And so what you see here is that as you go from the pre-industrial to the control, this is very healthy calcification. There's no dissolution. There's a little bit in the control. But as you get to that scenario that we're on right now, you have very low calcification and a lot of erosion. And so if you think about the range here, reefs are basically slipping away. All right. So this future, these are those data I was talking about in terms of temperature. You've got the bleaching threshold, 29.9, and then you've got what happens to sea temperature over time. And so you have to ask the question, if we already know that little excursions like that have a really big impact on coral reefs, how are we going to get to a point where the winter temperatures may be above today's summer temperatures? And that goes for a lot of different parts of the world. Phuket in Thailand, the south coast of Jamaica. All right, well, that was then. That was in 1999. Since then, we've had various assessments, updating the models. This is one that was led by Simon Donner. Same conclusions. When you get to just a couple of weeks ago, we published another one based on the current IPCC model projections. You find that coral reefs are in trouble if we get to about 2 degrees above the pre-industrial. And we have trouble. And of course, this is what this means in pictures. All right, there's today, beautiful reef. Here's what we would be looking like if you get to that scenario that I was sort of, corals aren't doing very well, they get outcompeted. And of course, if you get to 3 degrees, you're in that bin where corals are no longer keeping pace on reefs. Reefs are breaking down. All right, so is this really happening? And this is literally 2 days ago. The Australian Institute of Marine Science has published a really important paper where they took their long-term monitoring data from 1985 to now, and for a long while that data hadn't been sort of properly, the bias for sampling hadn't been taken out of it. And so they published this in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and I think it justifies this title that I had for this talk, which is that I think corals are gone. All right? It was published yesterday, a couple of days ago. Anyway, so what you see in this corner is the percent of coral cover across the entire Great Barrier Reef at a whole range of different sites. And you have the time, 85 to 2012. Coral in the early 80s was about 25 to 30% of the bottom of the Great Barrier Reef. A decade or so later, it hadn't dropped by much. It was down around about sort of 22.5. But look where it is today. It's less than 15%. And if you run this out, the conservative conclusion here is that we won't have coral on the Great Barrier Reef within the decade. It sounds awfully like Arctic summer sea ice, doesn't it? That's also dropping incredibly fast. Now, interestingly, they looked at the causes. Because they're doing these regular surveys, they're having a look at what was there, and the crown-of-thorns starfish, have you ever heard of that thing? This big coral predator, big starfish about that big, has 2 million babies every year and eats coral. What they found was that persistent grazing by the crown-of-thorns eating coral was a major player in this. In addition to that, cyclones. We've had 3 of the really biggest cyclones in the last decade, little like what's been happening in the Gulf of Mexico and southern United States. And then, of course, bleaching. And so you might say at first, well, bleaching's only a small part of this, so it's not mainly a climate issue. But I think what we will find, and this is speculative in some respects, but if you take the complexity of climate change and you say, okay, well, here we have human emissions, it's increasing temperature, I think that's a fairly solid data set and model. We have thermal stress, these extreme events are building up, we're getting the loss of corals from that. So that attribution chain is quite solid. It's probably also fair to say that the evidence for stronger storm systems as you heat up the ocean, as we heard from some earlier talks yesterday, that if you heat up the ocean you get bigger storms, you get more violent impacts on reefs, and they're taking a lot longer to recover from. And so this pathway is probably not too bad. Now, the crown-of-thorns has an interesting connection to climate change, and I think this is where we're going to go in the next couple of years. So this is really speculative, but... So we know for a while that there's been an intensification of the hydrological cycle, which is just simply a warmer world. There's a transfer of water into the atmosphere, about 6% more water. That creates bigger deluges, and so we've been seeing that over the last decade or so, and including in Australia. In the city I come from, we had the worst flooding ever, where 2/3 of the state was covered by water, about two years ago. Well, for a long time they've known that when you have floods and disturbed coastlines leaking nutrients and sediments into the ocean, the crown-of-thorns takes off about 2 to 3 years later. So I think what we're going to see is this attribution chain become actually something that's connected to climate change as well. And the point being from this is that it's the complexity of climate change which we're discovering, that small changes can change a whole bunch of different variables that then, on complex systems like coral reefs, have big impacts like the loss of coral. All right, so the way out. And this isn't just because I want to be an optimistic person. I actually am optimistic. And I'm optimistic because we are a society now that has 1 billion people connected up online. We have an ability to look backward in time with a certain surety and forward in time with an amount of accuracy and understanding. And technology is at a state which is just leaping and goes in leaps and bounds. So I'm a little bit of a technological optimist. But I also am very much of the mind that it's not just about technology. So I'm going to talk about the technology thing, and then I'm going to talk about the hearts and minds. I'm going to go outside my comfort space, because I'm meant to be a dry old scientist, and I may start crying on the stage here, so I just want you to know that. All right, so what are we going to do about this? Well, there are 2 ways to approach a climate issue. One is to mitigate, solve that CO2 problem, or the other one is to adapt. And at the heart of that decision currently is the issue of dollars. So let's do a worked example to see whether one is more expensive than the other. All right, so the first one is we could reduce fossil fuels, we could switch power supplies, build solar thermal, get geothermal going, do all that stuff, bury CO2, stop deforestation, grow trees, cost carbon correctly as a pollutant. And we could limit those other greenhouse gases. We could limit the amount of fracking, for example. I mean that in the best way. Okay, so what would that cost? Well, it's interesting. The IPCC in the 4th assessment report had a group that focused on this issue. What would it cost to do that switch? Now, what you hear, of course, is it's impossible, it's too expensive, it's going to send us broke. Well, nothing of the thought. When you look at their numbers, this is the sort of table to focus in on. It's really a summary of several chapters of intense scientific and expert consensus. And what you see there is that to limit CO2 to, I think it's 465 CO2 equivalents, it's going to cost about 0.12% of GDP growth over the next 50 years. So that doesn't sound like a lot of money, but then GDP growth's probably huge, right? It's like really big, so maybe that's a lot. Well, if you look at that, and so what I've done here is I've gone, well, we want to do better than the 465 CO2 equivalents, right? We want to really address this problem as rapidly as is possible. So we've quadrupled the numbers here, and so 0.5% of GDP growth over 50 years would be about $14 billion per annum for the world. $2 per person each year to save the planet. Okay, well, not everyone has our wealth or lifestyle, but I think even if I was asked to pay $20 annual subscription to the Earth, I'd pay it. I mean, it's cheaper than National Geographic, isn't it? But it's true. So it's cheap. All right. Okay, but still, you know, those economic rationalists will say, yeah, but, you know, that's much more expensive than adapting. That's much more sensible. So, oh, and I just wanted to point out that if we thought we hadn't done this before, your country, of course, came, you know, forth with the huge assistance to Europe post-World War II. And of course, this was, had some motivations, but it was one of the great charitable efforts of this country to Europe. And of course, the price of that was a lot more per head of population than the $2 per year for the planet. So on this basis, it doesn't seem a lot, but let's see adaptation. Okay, so here's my experiment. Here's the damaged reef, and I haven't done anything about climate change. I couldn't get away from the couch and the kids were distracting me. So I've decided I'm going to replant the reefs in 2030, 2040 when they've disappeared. So what would that cost? And in fact, I'm going to give you a simulation. Have a look at this simulation. This is what I'm going to do. See, that's pretty clever, isn't it? That's going backwards. That's a site on the Queensland coastline, a picture taken in 1900. The first one was in 2000. But what I've run it backwards to say, well, we could maybe create this reef by planting corals. So what would that cost? All right, well, I did it. And, you know, it's funny in science, you get bold after a while. I've been waiting to be cut down on this, but no one has. It's that egg again. So there's 40,000 square kilometres of coral-dominated habitat on the Great Barrier Reef. So the plan would be to plant a new coral colony every 5 square metres of that 40,000 square kilometres. That'll cost me $40 billion. That's one species. Given there's 560 different coral species that's found in and around the sort of Western Pacific and the Great Barrier Reef, I might want to do another 24. Well, you get to $1 trillion really easily. So that's $1 trillion, which is a lot more than the $1 billion cost that we saw. So I think you can safely say, and of course I'm only saving the Great Barrier Reef, I'm not dealing with agricultural issues, I'm not dealing with all the other problems of sea level rise and all the other things. So you have to say to anyone who says, oh, it's better to adapt or to not quite deal with the mitigation problem, we have to deal very firmly with the mitigation issue. The evidence is there. This is not activism, this is just the hard facts. So, okay, let's go and see where we go now. The next question is, well, if we're going to mitigate it, by how much? Now, when you look at the climate models, and these are ones done by Malte Meinshausen out of the Potsdam Institute, which is one of the leading institutes in the world. Here's our current pathway of CO2. It's equivalent to the RCP 8.5. Here is where we limit the amount of change. We keep the concentrations below about 450, and we don't allow the temperature to rise more than 2 degrees Celsius. That's a safe climate because the evidence that we have right now, and it's called the guardrail. This is the guardrail to say beyond this gets pretty difficult. And you look at the risks there. You know, loss of the Great Barrier Reef, the Amazon, alpine regions, food security, water crises, sea level rise, and so on. And you've only got to talk to the insurance companies of the world to understand what that really means. And I'll talk about a collaboration with an insurance company. They get this, because insurance claims are doing this even after they've been adjusted for changes in the price of currency and whatever. So that's our ambition. There's that line there. That would be good. As soon as we stabilise things, things can catch up. So what would we have to do to emissions? Would we just turn them down by 40%? Well, I don't know. What would it be? Well, it turns out we have to aggressively reduce emissions from now by sort of 3 to 5% over the next coming decades, or we will go down that red line. And again, that's what the evidence is telling us. So that sounds awful. What's the good news? Well, the good news is outside, and I'm not getting poetic, I'm still ADD scientist. I wish I could. I was so jealous of Kathleen, you know, that was just fantastic. But anyway, this thing here puts out 10,000 times our energy needs. And of course, the amount of territory you'd have to put into solar fields to trap enough energy to run the planet is something smaller than this. And I don't want to insult people in Arizona, but yeah, might be a good place to... I'm safe, aren't I? Yeah, okay. And of course, the other good news is that there are huge amounts of alternative technologies. And when you ask that question, so that little mind experiment about solar and North America, it's well known, but it's not realistic, right? You couldn't take that and put it into action. But the International Energy Association has looked at the potential for different renewable energies and finds that we've got more than enough, sixfold more than we need to power the planet. And in fact, at our institute, we've been putting this into practice. And this is Australia's largest solar array, rooftop array. It's 1.22 megawatts, which I know there are much bigger ones here in this country, but we're a small country and we're starting. But what was amazing about this was more, in many ways, when the renewable energy guys in my institute came to me and put this together, this was really like psychological counselling, because these solutions are, this thing pumps out that energy, right? But it pays for itself in 7 years. But it's got a life of something like 25 to 30 years. So we're planning to put in another 3 next year and hopefully take up 50% of the emissions of the university within 5. Now, that's amazing that a university can do that. And of course, the government leading with the right instruments and so on and making it happen as long as, you know, with the people, this is possible. We're also moving into Australia's first zero carbon, zero waste building. This is going to be my headquarters from April next year. And that's a building which has a clever skin. It opens and closes. It's got ways of dealing with the flow of air that don't require the huge amounts of energy. And supposedly it will be comfortable, although I must admit I'm a little worried. The architects told me that it might be above the comfortability index for 20 days of the year. I don't know whether that means we have to be seen in leotards inside the building, but I'll have to talk to the president of the university about that. This is a quote I really like. It's from your entrepreneur, Bill Gates. And I think this is one of the things, this is a wild card that we're dealing with, and that is that we always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the amount of change that will occur in the next 10. And his advice is don't let yourself be lulled into inaction. I think this is really, very wise advice. This is a graph to watch as well, also alluding to the computer industry as well. And this is the plummeting cost of solar PV. So you've got the date over time, you've got the cost per watt hour and per watt. And so that's decreasing. And it looks suspiciously like Moore's law if you were to flip it up the other way. Now, and of course, at $2 a watt, which it's close to, it becomes competitive with the other sources of energy. Now, Moore's law is an interesting one. Do you know Moore's law? So Moore's law is this idea that computing power, the number of transistors on a circuit board, has been doubling every 18 months, and it's been constant through, absolutely constant over time, and it's a law. Well, if this were true, then plotting it on a log scale, you should get a straight line, and that's what you get with the plummeting cost of solar. So if this is following Moore's law, then by 2030, the cost per watt will be 50 cents. And we've got no other reason to believe that won't happen. And I guess that's technology, but this is what oil prices do, and they will continue to do as demand goes up. If you have a finite energy source, be that uranium, yellowcake, or oil and gas, eventually the prices will go up quite steeply. And so it's, what would you want? Would you want the plummeting cost as a politician, or would you want the rising cost? And of course, that comes into the decision you make about what infrastructure to build today, because you can't build something and change it once you've started to build this stuff. You either build for oil and gas, or you switch now knowing that that price will be so much cheaper in the future. And that is at the heart of employment and manufacturing. If you have expensive energy, you don't have manufacturing because they go elsewhere, and you don't have jobs. All right, so the call to action. This is a big problem. 7 billion people we want to turn around. And so we've been quite proud of getting out to several hundred people and talking to them. But if we're going to solve this problem, we need to get out there to 1 billion people, and is that possible? Because we've got to get out to Russian grandmothers, Ethiopian businessmen, Australian teens, you name it. We've got to get out to those populations to drive the change that we're talking about, to get those hearts and minds. And of course, it comes down to how many people have done this. So, who's dived on a coral reef? Okay, that's about, I'd say it's 5%. Are people in agreement with that? So this is unusual to this statistic, which is 99.9% of humanity hasn't been diving on a coral reef. So why would they care? You know, why would all these people care about reefs thousands of miles away? We're told we're all connected, but, you know, a coral reef, what's that? I saw it on Sir David Attenborough once. It's overrated. So it's getting out to these people, and this is where it's really clunky, it really is coming down to you've got to get to the hearts, because we have 97% of all experts have been telling us that we have a major problem with climate change and we're not responding. We're not getting it, as we've heard already today. We're not getting that message. So it's got to be the heart, it's got to be the mind, and it's got to be the action. So how do you do that? Well, I think we've started something a couple of days ago, which I like to think of it as a bit of a game changer. We've gone into partnership with a major insurance company, Google, and a bunch of underwater photographers. We're the science guys. They're making the project happen and communicating and engaging it. And so with Google, and this is some of the tools on the science side. I'm not going to tell you much about the science. It's about detecting at a global scale using rapid photographic techniques and computer learning to analyse those transits and so on. It's very futuristic. Don't you think that looks like Jacques Cousteau? That's why I'm involved, really, just so I can wear the flippers. And of course, these automated ways of detecting change are important and everything. And not to demean the science is great. The next, if I can get there. Okay, what we launched was Street View for underwater. Yeah, I thought it was cool. So I recently stood in front of a TED audience and I said, you know, how many people went diving? And I said, who wants to come diving with me? Who wants to come diving with me? Don't. So all these people put their hand up and I said, and the best thing about this, you don't have to do any training and you can be in your armchair at home with a cup of tea in your hand. And so this is essentially what this project has done. I'll just play you a couple of clips here. There's a bit of sound. So here you go. You want to go diving on the Great Barrier Reef? So what the project is creating from the science side, which is rapid photographs, are these 360-degree street view-like images over kilometres of reef. And by the end of the year, we launched the actual collections in progress at the moment. But by the end of the year, we'll have 20 sites on the Great Barrier Reef where you can literally view 50,000 of these images and come with us on the journey of science, of discovering the impacts. See Cranithorn's devastation firsthand. See the impact of coral bleaching. And we think this is going to change things. The other thing we're doing is to... let me see if I can get this guy up. They're pretty big files. But the other thing is to actually make science live. And let me just have a fiddle here. Well, look, this I'll have to show you later, but basically we've got Google+, live hangouts, divers connecting up with audiences. So last week we connected a diver on Green Island on the Great Barrier Reef directly to the Blue Oceans Film Festival in Monterey. And people were interacting directly with this crazy guy, which I was hoping to show you a picture of. But it's really making science matter. People relate to it and so on. So instead of that 0.1%, we'll have, we hope, a lot of people doing this. Now, is this working? That's the big question. Well, we went out to 1.07 billion people. We have 1.8 divers that have dived on the Great Barrier Reef now on the sites that we have. And we have over 1.6 million Google+ followers. That's the sort of volume that we need to get to if we're going to turn this planet around in what I call, and many others do, the critical decade. And there's reason for optimism, because if we make the decisions today, take us on that emission pathway, everything's good. But 10 years from now, if this hasn't happened, in fact, I'd say 5 years, I'm no longer an optimist. Thank you. I got through most of it. Is that right?
That was great. Well, thank you, Dr. Hoegh-Guldberg, for that wonderful talk. We'll invite our panel back up to the front to begin the Q&A session in just a couple minutes. Please submit your questions either on paper or over the internet. Thanks.
it turned on?
It's on, yes.
Okay.
He went around the back.
Oh, we did.
Still not on. There we go. Oh, it's going now. Okay. Okay, folks, if you can find a seat, we managed to get the video working again, so you'll get a chance to see this before the Q&A session.
It's just a short video that shows the potential for engaging people over science. And for those people that are teachers in the audience, we're very keen on hearing from people that would like to get involved with the project. So if you search for Kaplan Seaview Survey, you'll find it. But let me just show you this, some of the crazy ideas we've had.
I'm Richard Fitzpatrick. I'm a marine biologist and underwater cinematographer. I've got to see some pretty amazing, cool things over the years, but the good thing about my job is that there's still so much more to see.
The Kaplan Seaview Survey is for the first time taking 360-degree panoramic images of the Great Barrier Reef, so we can look at how reefs change with time.
And to allow people to experience the Barrier Reef from anywhere in the world. An important part of the whole Seaview Survey is public engagement. The idea is that we don't just want to be static, we want to be swimming around the reef to allow people to come on the exploration with us. It's just like a virtual dive for the people at home without getting wet.
Hi guys, how are you today?
Hi Richard, how are you? Hey. Is that big green coral behind you there?
Oh, yeah, it is, look at it.
That's pretty spectacular.
There's some species that can live for over 1,000 years.
I'm thoroughly jealous of your
Diving, but this is definitely the next best thing to it. So.
Pretty cool to be able to talk to you guys.
What's that?
So, you garden worm at home, but it's so squished out flat like a ribbon.
It's yellow.
And sometimes you can make them swim. Oh, look, here we go. Oh, look, just look down. There's the Mary Reefs. I'll see if I can tease him out. Come on, come on. Oh, here he is. Look at this. He's coming up. Look at that.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
So this is the Mary Reefs.
We're facing an uncertain future on the reef, but to be able to communicate and talk about what's happening under there is just an amazing thing to do.
I hope you've enjoyed this hangout from underwater. And I hope to see you guys all soon. So have fun down there, eh?
Thank
Yeah,
you.
it was amazing. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye, guys.
Are you guys running out of air?
So I hope you can understand why I wanted to show you that video, because we've done this now twice. It's worked. We were in Singapore earlier this year and linked up, school kids with Richard. He seems to be an enormous amount of energy, but you can expose a lot of people to reefs and to why they're worth saving very efficiently through this type of technology. But anyway, there you go.
Well, Ove, I think that might work because the online questions come in on my iPad. I had to wrest it out of the hands of my son who was already on Google Maps looking at the ocean view. All right, so do we have any questions from the panel to get us started here?
Well, I thought I'd start with a question on submergence issues, which, as you think to the future and you think about submergence, how does the barrier reef hold up beyond global climate change and the models you've put up? It's as if we're not thinking about the fact that we're also going to be submerging it.
Yeah. Well, the issue of sea level rise for coral reefs is probably advantageous if corals are healthy. And so, is this on?
Yes.
Yep. So normally corals can grow fast enough to keep pace with even the fastest rates of sea level rise. But because we've got bleaching, we're changing the carbonate concentration, the water chemistry, there's an increasing prospect of us having drowned reefs. And they've seen those in the fossil record, I understand, where you have rapid subsidence and corals can't keep up. And so that's really an issue. Now, some of my students at the moment are studying, part of a sea level rise group, studying what the submergence of a reef crest does to the power that comes across that reef crest onto vulnerable coastlines. And this is this important role that coral reefs have in terms of protecting coastline. And it turns out that as you know, for every 30 centimetres you're dropping that reef crest, it's an inordinate amount of energy that then gets dumped onto coastlines and starts to threaten human infrastructure, especially with big storms.
All right, we'll take one from the audience then. A question from the audience asks whether other coral reefs are actually developing in areas that had been cooler and now are warming. So are we seeing a shift in the location?
Yeah, what we are seeing is that as higher latitude waters warm, we're seeing the spread of some coral species. But the important issue here is that the arrival of a coral species at these more northern sites is not the equivalent to a complete coral reef ecosystem with its goods and services coming, with that. It takes a lot more to move an entire reef. So I've calculated for the Great Barrier Reef, if it were able to move southward and keep pace with climate change, it would have to move, the entire reef system would have to move at the rate of about 15 kilometres per year. And that's, well, we've never seen that, and it's just impossible to think that that would happen. So the issue of migration of corals is probably going to happen, but entire reef systems, it's very unlikely in my opinion.
So are we back then to the rate problem that you talked about today, that it's not that it's happening, but how fast?
Absolutely. In fact, there is nirvana in the future. If we get to that blue line and stabilise temperature increases and changes in carbonate chemistry and so on, I think we will see reefs re-flourishing because they'll have time to catch up. And so new arrivals that come in that have higher heat tolerances will be able to sort of grow out and grow reefs. So I have been daydreaming. Around 2070, I'll be an old digger, but I'll still be on the planet hopefully, I don't know, if I eat my greens. Actually, I won't be, will I? 140.
Pretty good.
That's great. But there will come a time when reefs will flourish, and the science papers and the nature papers in these science journals will be going, new reef off, Florida, fish return too, and I think that will happen, but it'll be when we stabilise that rate of change.
Yeah. So obviously, I talked a little bit about the impact of the rising CO2 on the reefs. You've talked a lot about the changing temperature. Do you see any connections between those two where you have both things happening simultaneously?
You mean high CO2 and high temperature?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, they are coupled, right? And I think you're giving me a leading question there, Professor Sabine.
Sorry.
Possibly. You are so subtle. No, this point's a really important one, that a lot of what we've been looking at has been either studying the increase in sea temperature or the increase in ocean acidity. And it's the synergistic antagonistic effects that we don't know much about, and they could be really important. And they could be good news. It could be that maybe the effect of rising acidity may not be as much at high temperature and so on. But for corals, we find that they're amplifying the effect. You get bleaching at lower temperatures, for example, when they're in acidified oceans. But those synergies between factors and other ones like the way we treat coastlines, pollution and so on are really important. And in that latter case where they're non-climate variables, they actually may give us some options about responding to climate change to build some resilience into reef systems, and then to hopefully give them a better chance against a rampageous climate. But we really need to know a lot more about that.
It's just a brief question. Are you addressing that in a mesocosm?
Yes.
Repeat the question.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, Bill asked whether we're doing that in the mesocosm, the jacuzzi experiment. At the moment, we're running 4 different sets of conditions, which are combinations of temperature and ocean acidification. What we need to do is to start running those trials with pollutants, with extra nutrients and so on, and see what the opportunity is to perhaps back those factors off and improve circumstances. So we will be doing that, yes.
Okay, I want to share a whole series of questions that came in online, and they're coming in on paper as well, but I'm reading, how many countries are on board with solving this problem? I'd give $2 a year. What is preventing these changes from happening? Here's, hi, I'm 13. We have it with the 13-year-olds at this conference. Who do I give my money to? I'll pay a couple of bucks.
Good on them.
Yay.
So I realize those weren't questions.
Well, they're good ones, aren't they? I mean, how do we gather a global movement that begins to do things which are not happening today? But that's at the heart of that question. And I think as people that do thinking and research and so on, we need to really tackle that one, because if you don't respond to that, where can I help? Then you'll get a large and disillusioned generation, and I think that's a huge responsibility that we have. So we want to build. I mean, we're very ambitious with that project, but we want to build up a community of tens of millions of people and put them into action. So there's a thing that's really fascinating where you can develop citizen science online. So they do this at Cornell University, I think in their ornithology school or department, where they have these bird feeders, and every time a bird comes, it triggers and gets its photograph taken, and it builds up this enormous number of photographs, which the scientists can't really look at and so on. But there's an enthusiastic volunteer group that can train up on bird identification and do this online. And so this is really an interesting, very powerful way of getting people involved. It could be also that you identify parts of the world that might need help, and you get citizen science helping there, or I should say Earth, the people that are really enthusiastic about the Earth, wanting to save the Earth through those sort of things. So I think we've only just begun to scratch the surface here of what can be done. And I like to think that we've done globalization 1.0 really badly, right? You'd agree with this, I think. Haven't we? I mean, globalization is a great idea, but we've had so many casualties along the way. Maybe we need to be developing globalization 2.0, which is where we make it work and actually, start to get... People talk about the next 10 years as being the sharing generation. Sharing, where we will have to share because we've realized that this Earth is completely limited, ultimately. And, for me, these things haven't yet started yet. So again, I'm really optimistic.
Can I talk about that? Go ahead.
I'd just like to make a comment to the 13-year-old, and now we have another one, I guess. And I was really touched by that. And, one thing that I want to say to the children, and this even applies to the young adults in the audience to some extent, is that I think, adults, we are responsible for the children. And it is programmed in our DNA to try and protect you. And there are terrible things going on in the world at the moment that we're not doing anything about. And I think for the most part, it's not because we don't want to or because we're consciously doing that. It's a lot of it is apathy on the part of the adults, or they just don't know about it. And I think one of the powerful things that you can do as children is ask questions. And you should be asking questions of every responsible adult that you come across, and you should be asking your friends to ask questions. And I'm sorry that you have to do this, because this shouldn't be your burden, because we should be taking care of it ourselves. But there is nothing that touches our hearts like a child asking us why we're not doing something about this, saying that you're worried about it. And you can ask your parents, you can ask your teachers, you can write to your congresspeople, you can write to the president. And you should be doing these things, and they will listen. And don't think that your voice won't make a difference, because it's that collective voice, the many voices coming together, that really do change the system. And you're much more powerful than you know, just by looking into our eyes and asking us, what are you doing about this? And if not, why aren't you doing anything?
Well, I have an answer. I think you should watch The Wizard of Oz, in which a young girl goes around to all the grown-ups and tries to get them to solve her problem, until one of them tells her, really, you can solve the problem yourself. You have the power. Don't look to us and all these fancy people and all the people who are up there on the stage, the wizard behind the curtain. They're not going to do it for you, but you have a lot of power yourself. You know, and nobody can do everything, but everyone can do something. So decide what it is you can do. For one thing, you can tell everybody what you learned here. Almost everybody in the world who is seen as very influential, they really don't do anything except talk. That's all they do. And we happen to live in a country where you're allowed to talk so far. Yeah. You can blog, you can write, you can do things in school, you can get ready to be a conscientious and aggressive voter who is involved in politics if you like politics. If you hate politics but you love science, get involved in science. If you don't like politics or science but you like helping people, you can volunteer or join the Peace Corps or go to medical school. There's a lot of things that we can do. But it's not up to the wizard to tell you how to get there.
That said, and I think everything that everyone is saying is very true and very important. That said, I think that whole series of questions about, I got my $2, let's get going, is a cry for leadership, for real leadership. And I think that...
Absolutely.
Our leaders are so far behind the people. And so all of us, I think, not those who like it, all of us need, I think, to be involved in political action and moving people, putting pressure on the people who are supposed to be leading us, which, to their shame, they are not.
So I think it's leadership with conviction, right? I mean, you can get in front of a crowd and call yourself a leader, but it's whether you have conviction. Yeah. And the staying power.
Or should be convicted.
Yeah, right, yeah. That happens a lot, apparently. American politics.
All right. Well, we're actually just about out of time, but this is a question that has come up over and over in the last 2 days, and we haven't asked it yet. But we don't have time, I think, for the panel to answer it. So I want you to answer it. What do you say to someone who thinks global warming isn't real?
Wake up, that's a good one.
Right, and I think it's a question that everyone at this table can answer, but I think hopefully it's a question that everyone in the audience can answer now. Mm-hmm. Yeah? So this is the final panel discussion. Thank you all. And there's one talk left after the banquet. I hope that you're going to join us in person or in Alumni Hall or online to hear it.
you hit a home run today.